Next, we'd like to welcome Judy Stove, who is a writer and researcher. She's based in Sydney, Australia, and she's an Austen scholar, writer, and researcher. And she will speak to us about Anne Lefroy. Judy? Oh, I'm sorry, I read the wrong sentence. The topic is Your Ever-Affectionate Sister, Rachel Henning's Austenian Letters. Go ahead, Judy.
Thanks a lot, Bob and Susie, and thanks for the invitation. I'm just going to try and share my screen and start my slideshow. Okay, can you see my screen at the moment?
We cannot see it yet.
Oh, okay, sorry about that.
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the letters of Rachel Henning, which appeared, first of all, in the Bulletin magazine, and that's very much the period that Professor Wilkes referred to earlier, first published in the Bulletin magazine and collected in an edition edited by David Adams in 1963. And the life of Rachel Henning covered the period from Cassandra Austen's lifetime, in fact, Mrs. Austen's lifetime, right up until the First World War. So she had a very long and an interesting life. Now, as I say, when the letters were collected in 1963 and introduced by Norman Lindsay, he was a great fan, and he had this to say about her letters. And I'll just quote the last sentence here. He says, "To my mind, women write the most entertaining letters, so they deal only with the realities of the present moment and the enlivening ingredients of gossip, which is always more revealing than a psychological investigation of motives." Now, the very same, of course, could be said about Jane Austen and her letters, and indeed Lindsay himself made the link in a letter to his sister. "I like Rachel, who has a touch of Jane Austen in her." We might note, however, that not all male readers have been as sympathetic as Lindsay was, even to Austen as letter writer. Harold Nicholson, in his famous 1956 address to the Jane Austen Society AGM, found Jane Austen's letters quite confronting. And he wasn't a fan of the novels either. He found the novels almost unbelievably snobbish, and the author shown as callous. And against that background, he found the letters refreshingly free of class consciousness, but not of triviality. And his praise, as we can see here, was faint and severe. "I do not mind the letters being trivial. I certainly do not find them dull. I find them revealing." Now, there's a very, very excellent chapter in the recent book just last year by Claudia L. Johnson and Clara Chewett, 30 Great Myths About Jane Austen, as an excellent chapter on the letter reception. But I don't think it covers Nicholson's account, which really would merit some scholarly examination. Because what Nicholson goes on to do is give what he calls 4 schools of Austen letters apologists. He describes a school which denies that they are trivial, the Cassandra got rid of the interesting parts school, a position with which Nicholson disagreed, the letters were important family information school, which sought to explain why Austen failed to mention national events such as the Battle of Trafalgar, and 4, the school which attributed the gossipy tone of the letters to Austen's accommodation of a presumed deficiency in the chief recipient, of course, Cassandra. Now, as I say, it's a very interesting analysis that Nicholson's given, and it gives us a starting point from which to view Rachel Henning's letters. And we find 2 stumbling blocks early on. The first is that Rachel Henning was unquestionably a snob, at least early in the letters, a snob in a way that's painful for us to read. And the second is her attitude towards Indigenous Australians, although, as we shall see, this too may have changed over time. She was born in April 1826, and she pretty soon became the sole carer for her siblings after the death, first of their father and second of their mother. And she took that responsibility very seriously. So Rachel, her mother and siblings moved among cousins and uncles in various locations. And Brother Biddulph, who was younger than Rachel, attended school, joined a firm in Manchester, but then because his health was delicate, made the decision that he and his sister, Annie, would travel out to Australia. So Biddulph and Annie went to Australia on the SS Great Britain, the longest passenger ship in the world at that stage. And it was famous for its ability to reach Melbourne 60 days out from Liverpool. Straight away, Rachel missed them, and she wrote to them straight away as they left in August 1853. My dearest Annie, I was so rejoiced to see your handwriting again and to get the 2 letters from you and Biddulph. What a wretched day that Thursday was. And a year after that first letter, Rachel herself, along with another sister, Amy, and cousin Tregenna, followed their siblings to the new colony. They travelled on the HMS Calcutta, a former Royal Navy ship, which saw action in the Napoleonic Wars. Its first commander, one William Bligh. The relative freedom to travel, which Jane Austen had celebrated as one of the features of Navy life, and which served as a practical education for her character William Price, had become democratised with the transformation of Navy vessels into mass civilian transport. And on board, we perceive for the first time how class-conscious Rachel is. I have not said anything to you, this is the married sister Etta, about the passengers because we do not know anything of them. There are very few of whom I can remember the names, although Tregenna sometimes tries to enlighten me about his friends. He has found a set, some of them Oxford men, with whom he smokes and drinks beer, but in general, all the passengers keep to themselves, which I think much the pleasantest way. There are very few ladies among them at all, and hardly any in the real sense of the word. Ouch, but there is worse. Some of the second-class passengers are very troublesome. We feel apprehensive about how Rachel will react to what awaits her in the colony, and our fears are more than realised on several levels. Biddulph and his sisters settled at Appin, southwest of Sydney, in early 1855. The soil was poor. Rachel concluded this is said to be the driest part of Australia. The vegetable garden fails because of the drought and because the chickens dig up the few seedlings. Rachel takes no interest in the local flora. I do not care enough about the Australian flowers to take much trouble with them. Of course, the weather itself is a problem. I like this autumn weather. This was in March 1855, for it feels like England. Amy rejoices in the cool weather, and I was tired of the perpetual glare of sunshine. Fine days here bring me no pleasure as they do in England. They're too hot and too numerous, and besides, you can't enjoy them by taking nice walks. There are no walks to take. Rachel's brother-in-law in England, Mr. Boyce, was so concerned by the tone of the letters that he invited the siblings to return to live with him and Etta. In the meantime, however, Amy Henning had become engaged to a banker in Bathurst, New South Wales. Biddulph was planning to buy land. Rachel herself was miserable. I do wish I had gone home last autumn. I've done no one any good by staying. And as single women, just as Jane and Cassandra Austen had been half a century before, Rachel and Annie were supporting actors in their siblings' stories, not the lead players. A visit to Amy, now Mrs. Sloman, at Bathurst was undertaken by Rachel in April 1856, taking the coach from Sydney over the Blue Mountains. The drive from Penrith to Hartley said he had never seen the road so bad. The ascent of the Blue Mountains on the Penrith side was almost impassable. Predictably, the view down Mount Victoria was very fine, certainly, but no equal to Snowdon by any means, while Bathurst is an ugly place enough. We're not surprised when Rachel returns home to England later that year to stay with Etta and Mr. Boyce. In her absence, Biddulph sells the Wooleye property and ventures to Queensland to buy land. Rachel missed them so much that 5 years later she returns to Sydney, arriving in May. Somehow everything is different this time around. I do not know how to give you any idea of the beauty of Sydney Harbour. I certainly underrated the Australian scenery, but then it is winter now. I wish I could give you the least idea of the beauty of the scenery here. That's Lapston and the lower Blue Mountains. It was a lovely morning. We wound along one side of the hill with a deep ravine on our right, and on the other side of the ravine, a wall of rock that seemed to rise up to the sky with trees growing out of every crevice and the sun shining on top, while all below was black shade. I'd forgotten how magnificent those Blue Mountains were. And this picture I've chosen to illustrate is by Eugène von Gerard about exactly the same time, or possibly a few years later, than Rachel was writing. But in fact, of course, the transformation was within Rachel herself. now seeing the same views with new eyes. Even the inevitable setbacks with incompetent coachmen and muddy roads this time provoke only laughter, including with the description of the Bathurst dogs. And here we see for the first time Rachel's skill at sketching a scene. I'll just read the second part here. The chorus that Bathurst dogs raise at night is quite heartrending. When we take Prince, our old brown pointer, who is rather of a quarrelsome disposition, into the town, we generally get a whole pack after us. I'm fond of dogs, but they may be too much of a good thing. So just as Jane Austen in another age would have shone as a book reviewer, Rachel Henning, 50 years later, would have excelled as a journalist. She reports attacks by bushrangers, issues sharp commentary on the US Civil War then in progress, the poor state of the church in New South Wales, and even the scores in the cricket match between England and Victoria for the benefit of Mr. Boyce. The next adventure was to move to Queensland, where Biddulph had settled, and calling his property in the Kennedy country, Exmoor. Rachel and Annie took the coastal steamer to Rockhampton, arriving in August 1862, where Biddulph met them. With George Hedgeland, of whom more later, and others, the party rode up country with pack horses, other horses and luggage. And again, Rachel sketches a nice picture of the end of the day. When it got dusk, we all drew around the fire, and I wish I could send you a picture of the camp then. Annie and I had a very comfortable sort of sofa made of a railway rug and the packs off the horses to lean against. Biddulph was sitting on a log in his shirt sleeves reading the home news by the firelight, Mr. Hedgeland kneeling on the grass, manufacturing a damper for next day's consumption. And between the lines of Rachel's text, it's the confidence of Biddulph, whose health, which was so despaired of back home, appearing equal to every bush exertion. All Biddulph's improvements, we're told, are capital. Biddulph is a capital driver. Biddulph and Mr. Hedgeland can rescue animals from bogged creeks. In early September, the party reaches the property in Queensland at Exmoor, and Rachel writes, I like Exmoor very much, and I think we shall be very happy in our new home. She writes, Sunday seems so quiet in the bush. It's a beautiful afternoon, the warm air blowing in through the open door and window, and whispering among the gum trees, cloud shadows gliding over the opposite mountain range, great Lion the bloodhound lying asleep in the doorway, quite regardless of being walked or fallen over, Biddulph arrayed in white trousers, white coat and regatta shirt, nobody ever sits in the parlour without a coat, is lazily reading in an armchair in the pleasant recess where the books are. Mr. Hedgeland, in a similar airy costume, is writing to his aunts, the Miss Hedgelands at Exeter, at the table. Annie, in a very pretty black and green mohair dress trimmed with green silk lozenges, is also writing to Amy. Mr. Taylor and Beckford, who came in last night, are sitting on, and the other from the station 40 miles off, are sitting on the veranda discoursing. So just a quick sidelight on what Rachel herself read. We find in the letters that she doesn't seem to have read Jane Austen, but she did read a number of other female writers. Elizabeth Gaskell, she and Annie are reading Mary Barton to each other, the novels of Charlotte M. Young, and poems by Jean Ingelow, which were very, very popular in the 1860s. Rachel's particular job on the farm was to care for the orphan lambs. I'm generally to be seen walking about with a quart pot full of milk and a train of 9 lambs behind me. They're such gentle, helpless creatures that I'm very fond of them, though it is rather trouble to feed them 3 times a day. Lion the bloodhound finds a snake, and we can see this gorgeous Norman Lindsay illustration of Rachel dragging Lion away from the snake. So one major inconvenience of bush life was the unpredictability of communication. We have a regular mail now, this is in early 1864, but we've hardly felt the benefit of it yet, for owing to the floods, the roads have been impassable, and even the steam was stopped at Rockhampton for 3 weeks. The Fitzroy was a mile wide. And the close comradeship at Exmoor, the kind of equal partnerships which Jane Austen had Anne Elliot wistfully contemplate in Persuasion as the Navy norm, was to result in 2 marriages. Annie became engaged to George Hedgeland. Now, recent research by Angela Phippen and Beverly Sherry has revealed that George Hedgeland was not simply Biddulph's right-hand man on the Exmoor property. Before leaving England, he was a highly accomplished stained glass artist. And we can see here, it's the west window of Norwich Cathedral, which he had executed before leaving England. I think he also did the window at Jesus College, Oxford. Now, Hedgeland never returned to his stained glass work in Australia, and Rachel never refers to it in the letters. It has been suggested that his brightly coloured style was out of fashion by the 1860s, when a more authentic and restrained style had emerged. Rachel herself was to marry one of Biddulph's employees, the sheep supervisor, Mr. Taylor. And Dayton Taylor was only 30 to Rachel's 37. This may have been one reason why they kept their engagement secret. Rachel finally writes to Etta in May, "I should be very glad if you and Mr. Boyce will say nothing to anyone till you hear something more. Of course, it is immeasurably foolish for anyone of my age to enter into an engagement like this, but I don't want to be told so on all sides at once. I'd rather take it by instalments." But as she also points out, they'd known each other very well. And their marriage proved a very happy one, even though there were no children. The other main difficulty we have with Rachel's letters is the attitude to Aboriginal Australians. And this is probably a reason why, although the work's been described as bestseller, it's not so well known today. After living for some time in the bush, Rachel comes to notice the tensions in the black Aboriginal communities between what were called the wild blacks, that is living a more traditional lifestyle, and the so-called boys, so Aboriginal men who worked with the white settlers. And she reports a violent encounter at Christmas 1863. And as I say, Rachel is gradually noticing the tensions and drama and tragedies involved. And in this binary attitude, the so-called wild blacks living a traditional lifestyle are a threat, while the employed Aboriginals are thoroughly useful. In fact, the native police, so-called, were Aboriginal men employed to protect the white settlers from the more traditional Aboriginal residents. We're told that Biddulph does not permit the so-called boys, that is the employed Aborigines, to shoot a raiding party of so-called wild blacks who had robbed a shepherd's hut. But within a year even, there are fewer and fewer Aboriginal people living a traditional lifestyle. A party of former so-called native police from Rockingham Bay absconded from their post and arrived at Biddulph's property. But the mounted police supervisor shortly arrived to bring them back. Rachel writes, "They took it very philosophically, but I was quite sorry for the poor creatures. Some of them were very lame and footsore, and 3 of them were women. They must have walked nearly 400 miles from Rockingham Bay here." Biddulph keeps 2 of the men to work on the station and has them looking for horses. So we can see the first glimmerings of a more humane attitude, yet overall the original inhabitants of the land are seen as a curiosity, an inconvenience, when no longer a direct threat. But it is also important to note that Rachel's commentary on Irish working people is just as dismissive. As it turned out, the Exmoor idyll was over by the mid-1860s. Rachel and Mr. Taylor moved to Sydney and lived in a number of properties, and so did the surviving siblings. First, they went to Stroud and then finally into Sydney. Early in the 20th century, Biddulph, Annie and Rachel, who were all widowed by that stage, lived at a residence called Passy in Hunters Hill in Sydney, which is still standing. And curiously for Sydney people, it's the family home of disgraced Labor identity Eddie Obeid. But luckily, as I say, it's still standing. And of Rachel, it was written later in her life, as it could have been written of Jane Austen. Rachel was of distinctive character, keenly observant and critical, but undemonstrative, with strong opinions, but rarely letting her personal feelings appear on the surface. Reserved, except when among her relations and intimate friends of long standing, a dry wit at all times, and often a very baffling person to strangers. Her little nephews and nieces, who themselves are now, this was written in the 1960s, grandparents, regarded her sometimes with awe. And this is Rachel and Dayton's gravestone in Ryde Cemetery. I'll just finish on this point. A keen-eyed Austenian would have noticed the address from which Rachel wrote the first letter of the collection in August 1853 was Adlington Hall in Cheshire. Now, Adlington Hall was the home of the Lee family of Adlington, which was The senior branch, according to John Burke of peerage fame, was the senior branch of the Lee family to which Jane Austen's mother belonged. Were there still Lees living at Adlington Hall in Cheshire when Rachel Henning stayed there in 1853? And I'm going to do some further investigation of this. The evidence is unclear at that stage, but there remains a tantalising possibility which will repay examination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was wonderful. We have a couple of questions. Just how isolated was Rachel's family? In particular, if she had gotten pregnant, who would have delivered the baby?
That's a really good question. They were incredibly isolated. In fact, it's very difficult for us to even grasp how isolated they were. Rachel writes how you had to wait months to get a new pair of boots. And of course, there was literally no medical care. All the medical care was do it yourself. They had some wonderful powders and potions. But yes, it was incredibly isolated, especially as she notes when there were floods. I mean, it's considered outback territory even now, the Kennedy country, let alone in the 1860s. So she really did bridge the gap between Jane Austen's world and the colonial experience. The 4 schools of Jane Austen slide again. Yes, I'll just try and get that up. Yeah, I strongly recommend the book from last year, 30 Great Myths About Jane Austen, and the wonderful chapter on the reception of the letters, but I don't think it covers Nicholson's 4 schools, which, yeah, I'd really love to write about. No, this one. I'll just try and share that.
And while you're pulling that up, what are you working on next?
Am I sharing that? No?
Yes.
Oh, okay. What am I working on next? I'm actually working on a paper to do with Germaine de Stael for a collection to come out early next year.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Judy. This has been really wonderful. And we are rapidly wrapping. We have a lot of people have been hanging in here the whole day, so we appreciate that. So we're going to take a quick break and just a very short break, 3 minutes. So come back at 21 after the hour. Thanks, everyone.